Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Mohsin Mughal. It was a summit meant to hammer out sticking points between three countries leading the peace efforts in Syria. After all was said and done, differences remain between the presidents of Turkey, Russia and Iran. But that didn't overshadow the agreements they shared, including facilitating the return of refugees and, crucially, the setting up of a constitutional committee to determine Syria's political future. Meeting with his Russian and Iranian counterparts for the fourth time in less than a year and a half, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called for an end to the suffering in Idlib, where a shaky ceasefire is barely holding. Russian President Vladimir Putin reiterated that the presence of fighters in Syria's last rebel stronghold shouldn't be tolerated and that a final solution was needed. But according to the Kremlin, a much-feared regime offensive won't happen for now. Looming in the background was the pending US withdrawal from northern Syria. Differences over who will fill the power vacuum left by the Americans was a touchy issue, but all leaders agreed the withdrawal was welcome. Erdogan reiterated that the Turkish military could clear the area in Syria's northeast, currently held by the US-backed YPG terror group.
Syria's territorial integrity will not be ensured unless the YPG terror group is cleared away from Manbij, east of the Euphrates.
The Iranian President Hassan Rouhani also had tough words for the US, accusing them and Israel for supporting terrorists in the region.
What the Americans do both under the current authority and the previous ones does not secure the interests of the nations of the region. What we want is for the United States to review its policies in the region.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined by Yasser Tabara, Senior Fellow at the Omron Center, and Murat Yetkin, former Editor-in-Chief at the Hurriyet Daily News. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. We are 2 years into the Astana process. What do you think is the takeaway from this latest round of talks? Murat, you can go first.
All right. What we can take from this fourth round of meeting of three leaders is that Erdogan, for the first time, said he was hopeful for a political solution in Syria, and we see a path towards more flexibility of Ankara towards a solution with Assad in Syria. We can see this from the statements of Putin and Rouhani, who are pushing sort of Turkey for implementing Astana Protocol, which means we can get into details of Astana Protocol, but which means formally or informally acknowledgement of the present government in Syria in order to have better cooperation against terrorism, whether it's Daesh or whether it's PKK, PYD.
All right, we'll come to where this process has led. We'll get into a bit of background as well. But I'll ask this question to you, Yasser. There's been a discussion about the imminent pullout of US troops. How much of an impact will that have on the ground, and who is to benefit from that?
Well, I think the perhaps more relevant question is whether such a pullout is taking place.
Happen at all, yeah.
I mean, what we're seeing is that on the ground, in effect, we're seeing sort of the opposite of that. We're seeing that some of the American forces are being reinforced by new troops. We're seeing that the French are investing a little bit more in their presence in their sort of area. So I think there's a realization, and now you see that divide that is taking place between the White House and those who are actually implementing the policies in eastern Syria from the American administration, from the American government. It's still to be seen whether what the timeline of such a withdrawal is going to is going to look like, whether it is going to take place in the first place. But obviously there is a realization right now within the American establishment that there is the area is not ready. The security structure of that area is not ready for the Americans to pull out.
All right, I'll ask you this question, Murat. There has been a valid argument. I mean, presence of PYD, YPG terror groups in Manbij and east of Euphrates as well. For example, they are a threat to the territorial integrity of Syria as well, and that has been reiterated by all the leaders, that there is a concern that we want to keep the territorial integrity of Syria intact. But how can we deal with that threat? And that threat of YPG and terror groups like PYD are also a threat to the territorial integrity of Syria. How do we deal with that?
True, but only Turkey is prioritizing that threat as number one. In the eyes of Americans, PYD, YPG is part of Syrian Democratic Forces, is the main land force they use against Daesh. They have started another offense in Deir Zor recently, saying that this is going to be the last one. I think there's a joke going on in social media that it's 1,000th time it's the last offense. But Trump had said when he announced that there's going to be a troop withdrawal that Daesh was finished. So if Daesh had finished what we are observing now. Yeah. So this is going to continue for some more time, in my opinion. And for Russia, for example, PYD, YPG is not a number one threat. When Americans said there's going to be a troop withdrawal, we have seen through Anadolu Agency the pictures, the photos of Russian and YPG troops or militia patrolling together around Manbij. So there's a lot of double talk sort of going on in the area. Yes, everybody is saying that they are for the territorial integrity of Syria, but in which form? That's important. So
yeah, okay. Going back a little to the ground situation, Yasser, Assad regime has consistently been violating the Idlib ceasefire. They've been pounding with bombs. What does that tell us about Assad's intentions? I mean, there has been his guarantors in Sochi are talking about keeping this peace deal, at least in Idlib, intact, but he seems to be showing complete disregard for that.
Well, it's not just the Assad regime that is showing the disregard. I mean, I think even the guarantors themselves, statistically, since the conflicting zone that was decided on in Sochi back in 2018, there has been over 35 Russian air raids, for example, on Idlib. There has been over 1,000 incidents of bombardment of Idlib. About 73 or 75% of those are actually targeted towards civilians, and as opposed to what they agree on to be the common threat, which is the HES. And so I think there is definitely an intention to keep the pressure on the question of Idlib, but whether there is an intention to overtake Idlib, I think that is something that the three parties have to agree on, the Assad regime, the Russians, and the Iranians.
All right, despite that, I mean, there are definitely differences on the ground. There's a bit of doublespeak as well on part of Syria and its guarantors to a larger extent, as you've highlighted. But more or less, this process, this Astana process, has actually been more effective. Just to give our viewers a brief understanding of the whole process, I'm just quickly going over to what led up to the Thursday's trilateral summit in Sochi. It all started in January 2017 with a formal ceasefire, which was agreed to with Turkish and Russian backing. Syrian rebel leaders also met with Assad's regime for the first time there. Then in May, 4 de-escalation zones were proposed after Iran backed the peace process, beginning a rapid decline in violence across Syria. The following January, talks were then held in Sochi to supplement the Astana process. It was the largest dialogue between Syrians, with 1,500 delegates attending that round. And in September, the framework saw its biggest success after halting a regime offensive into Idlib, after the presidents of Turkey and Russia reached a deal on a demilitarized zone. I'm going to ask you this question again, and I'll start with you, Yasser. Can we say the Astana process as a whole has been more effective compared to the Geneva-led process? And if at all it has been effective, what do you think is the reason for that effectiveness?
That's sort of a tricky question, because it really depends on whose perspective you're talking about.
Okay.
Obviously, from the perspective of the Russians, who desired from the very beginning to circumvent the international process and to Astanize Geneva, if you will, they've wildly succeeded in doing that, and they have pretty much moved the initiative from you know, the international community and the Geneva communique into Astana and the Russian sort of desire on how they see a political solution should unfold in Syria. In the Geneva process, we were talking, the international community was talking about a true transitional governing body that eventually will lead into a true transition of power, into a true constitutional process that will produce a number of serious reforms that would hopefully get us to a point where we deal with the root causes of what took place in 2011 in the first place, and not repeat that vicious cycle of protests and violence. Now, the Russians, on the other hand, all they care about is to affirm, you know, the situation and the position of their client, the Assad regime, and decided to enter the process militarily and get it to where it is right now. And so, again, I mean, it really depends on which perspective.
I see Murat nodding his head. I'm not sure if he's in agreement with that, but I'll ask you a very specific question.
I want to add one detail to what Yasir had said.
Okay, I'll let you do that.
I think Russian and Iranian positions vis-à-vis Assad regime is not the same. Okay. They're saying this openly now. Yeah. Rouhani had a statement. I think all Russia is caring for is to extend its zone of influence in the Middle East. I mean, it was non-existent, but thanks to Obama's hesitation in 2013, Russia is back. So with or without Assad, Russia wants to stay there, but Iran has to stick with Assad regime. That's what I want to say.
Okay, that's the crux of it. But I just want to come to a very specific thing that I've been wanting to ask and find out. And I'm going to read this out to you, Murat. The Turkish president said during the conference with his counterparts, Vladimir Putin and Hassan Rouhani, yesterday, and he said, "We have preserved the spirit of the Astana process despite the problems and provocations." I just want to understand and help us understand this. We understand the problems and differences are there, but what are these provocations that the president is referring to?
There's a few, but mainly he's talking about the PYD, the presence of PYD and American collaboration with PYD forces against Daesh, or in order to make a permanent presence in east of Euphrates, in northeast of Syria, perhaps in parallel with the desires of Israeli government as well, because they want a buffer zone, whether it's a Kurdish buffer zone or Martian buffer zone, whatever, between Iran and themselves.
All right, we'll come to that as well. We'll try to find out how we can deal with those provocations on the ground as well. We've touched on various groups, we've touched on various opposition fighters that are operating in Syria, but there is one group that could potentially play a leading role if Turkey's military campaign to clear the YPG terror group does go forward. The Free Syrian Army was one of the first to take up arms against Bashar al-Assad, but their journey hasn't been a smooth one. Sarafarth, who was embedded with one of their battalions, has this report.
Northern Syria, home to the Hamza Brigade, a faction fighting the Assad regime.
We are not terrorists. We are revolutionaries, and we have the right to live with freedom, dignity, and justice.
These men are known as the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. The war they're fighting against the Assad regime is in its 8th year. At the military base for the Hamza Brigade. So this is where we're going to be spending the night. For almost a week, we lived with the Hamza Brigade, waking, sleeping, eating and moving when they did, to find out what life inside the FSA is like. Life in the FSA starts early. Rajib Shaiko is a military commander. He's waking the fighters up for their morning training. Though the Free Syrian Army operates under one name, across the country and over the years, there have been hundreds of different brigades. These fighters come from Homs, Aleppo, eastern Ghouta, all areas taken back by the Assad regime in a bloody offensive.
When the revolution started, I was in secondary school. I remember regime forces opening fire and attacking students. Their actions were terrorizing everyone. My decision to join the Free Syrian Army came after my brother was killed by the regime.
Zaid and Mohammed are friends from their hometown in Ghouta. Barely into adulthood, both have already become hardened fighters.
I joined Jaish al-Islam when I was 19 years old. We fought Daesh and the regime there until we were displaced and moved to the north. Here I joined the Hamza Brigade because it's the most moderate and most powerful group in the area.
Mohammed's wife is still in Ghouta. He tells us he's only seen his 7-month-old daughter Marie once, the day she was born. For now, in this part of Syria, the regime is being held at bay. The FSA here are backed by Turkey and have so far managed to hold this territory. Today, the head of the Hamza Brigade has come to rally the fighters. Saif Pullout is a former officer from the Syrian Air Force intelligence branch, known as the Mukhabarat al-Jawiya. The branch is the most feared of the Syrian intelligence. Saif worked with them for 7 years before defecting to the opposition in 2012.
At the beginning of the revolution, we were going to suppress the demonstrations. But as the numbers got bigger in all areas, the head of the security branch started holding meetings every day. On the 3rd week of demonstrations, he said, "Shoot whoever you see in front of you."
Early morning at the Hamza base. We're getting ready to head to the front line now with the Hamza Brigade here in northern Syria. Here on the FSA front line, Rajib is 7 years and many miles from his home in Aleppo and his former life.
Before the revolution, I was studying law. During my 2nd year, anti-regime protests kicked off in Aleppo. We witnessed how the regime started detaining people randomly. After that, I decided to go back home in the countryside. Our area was first controlled by the Free Syrian Army, and later Daesh was founded, and they became the most powerful group. Daesh militias stormed my house and attempted to detain me. I managed to flee to Turkey. I stayed there for a long time. I miss my family and my hometown, but I can't go back because of the regime.
But this front line is with Manbij, and the fight here right now is not with the regime, but with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Force backed by the US. The Hamza Brigade also used to receive US funding. Now their former ally is on the opposite side of this latest territorial dispute.
There were many changes to the FSA over the course of 7 years. There was a transition from fighting the regime to fighting Daesh and then to fighting separatist groups like the PKK and the YPG. Now the FSA have begun to organize and are starting to build a national army.
The FSA's fight for freedom, though, can sometimes feel very far away from the monotony of life as a fighter here. But there are moments of light relief. Some evenings the fighters get a chance to relax, drinking coffee, playing cards, and singing and playing music. Sometimes they're the fighters the last 8 years of war has made them. Sometimes they appear as the young men they are. The bonds they've formed in this FSA brigade are strong. But this wasn't the life they'd envisaged for themselves before the war started.
I want to graduate so I can open a law firm and also get married and have children and live a happy life. A message to Bashar al-Assad. We will liberate our country. We have a true cause and truth eventually will prevail.
For now, Rajib and his men train and wait for the next order, another operation, and for a victory in their revolution that might never come. Sarah Firth, Straight Talk.
Well, the FSA has evolved a lot over the past 7 years, but one thing that hasn't changed is their refusal to accept Bashar al-Assad as Syria's legitimate leader. I'm going to ask Yasser this question to you. What does the future hold for FSA? If at all there is an agreement reached, if at all the political positions are changed, where is FSA headed?
Well, it's important to point out that the latest iteration of the FSA right now, it's something called Jabhat Tahrir al-Wataniya, or the National Liberation Front. And these are the consortium of factions that comprise the FSA at one point, but are mostly in Idlib, and they're really the counterforce for HTS in Idlib if they were given the chance to fight them, and they have a very clear position vis-a-vis HTS. And they're also present in areas like Euphrates Shield and Afrin. They definitely have a potential role to play. Things have to be very clear in terms of a strategy and in terms of what their main ally has in mind. And for example, in order for them to actually start a serious offensive against HTS in Idlib, that necessarily means that there will be a number of, there will be another potential refugee crisis from Idlib towards Turkey and beyond, towards potentially Europe. You'll see that there have been a number of steps taken towards the DDR process of these types of factions. And as such, there has been a lot of investment in ensuring that that process could potentially take place should we reach a political deal that will mean some form of integration of these factions within a larger military body. I don't know if that answers your question, but
well, it does to a larger extent. But I'll put this to Murat as well. Do you think with U.S. withdrawal, FSA could actually play a role in getting rid of YPG and PYD? Are they capable to do that?
Well, with Turkish support, they are doing their operations. And regarding playing a role, they have already been playing a role. I mean, from 2011 onwards. Without FSA presence, Turkey's Euphrates Shield operation, the Afrin operation would not be possible. I mean, they were the ground force, actually, supported by Turkish military. So they can play a role, yes, but not, I don't think, would you agree? Yes, sir, I don't think it would be across Syria, but in certain parts of Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's where their presence is right now, and these are the areas that they can function within. And I don't think, I mean, nothing in the cards of Syria future shows that there is a potential military confrontation that, you know, outside of these areas that we're specifically talking about, save, for example, maybe in the south, where you're seeing a little bit more of a disgruntlement by the factions that engaged in some of the temporary ceasefires or some of the deals or agreements that they had with the Russians in the south. Maybe there that could play, they could play a potential role in the future. But other than that, I don't see anything.
Can I add
yes, please.
2 sentences? First is that the backbone of Free Syrian Army is actually former Syrian army officers. So that's the backbone. So they are not aligned to Syrian system. Secondly, now they have a chair, I think, towards Geneva. And Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Turkish Foreign Minister's statement in Qatar a few weeks ago, answering a question regarding acknowledging Assad. He said if there's going to be an open and free elections, we can consider. So this was the first time. Then Turkish officials started to repeat that.
Yasir Tabara, Raditkin, thanks very much for being on the show.
Welcome.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Mohsen Mughal. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.